Okay, so this is free will. What is it, and do we have it? I expect this to be somewhat contentious, so feel free to violently and vehemently disagree with me. Okay.
No, you're wrong.
How many of you think you have free will? Hands up. Oh, interesting.
Wow.
Okay, so we've got, looks like a roughly 50-50 split. Okay. Hands up again one more time, if you wouldn't mind. Mark, why did you raise your hand when I asked if you had free will?
Because I feel that if I'm doing something that someone else isn't forcing me to do, then that's of my own free will.
Okay, so you feel that if I'll just repeat it for everybody, if you're doing something and nobody else is coercing you, then you have free will. So when you raised your hand, that choice that you made was predicated on your beliefs about what free will means, and upon the external stimulus that I applied to you when I asked you, do you have free will? That might have some interesting implications that we'll discuss in a little bit. What is free will? Anyone? It seems like a fairly basic question. Tim, yeah?
It's ill-defined depending on who you ask.
Oh, good. So your definition is it's ill-defined. Good, yeah.
It is generally
I agree.
what this charming fellow says.
Okay.
I find it generally to be defined.
So actually, what Mark, the way Mark has defined free will is actually very similar to the or it might be identical with the compatibilist position, which I'll be discussing in a little bit. So there are many definitions of free will. A lot of them actually descend very quickly into tautology, because when you think about it, it's sort of a hard thing to define. The most cogent definition that I've come across is that offered by apologist J.P. Moreland. So, what is free will? There are three main views of free will. The first is libertarian agency. These are the ones that I'll be discussing. If your pet version of free will is not here, I apologize. So libertarian agency, that is to say we have contra-causal free will. I'll discuss what that means in just a moment. The second view, sort of the oppositional view, the contrary position, is determinism. That is to say we don't have free will. Okay? And then finally you have compatibilism. That's free will can be defined in such a way as to be compatible with determinism. And that's the view held by many modern naturalist philosophers such as Daniel C. Dennett. Libertarianism. My notes just say, insert Ron Paul joke here. So in his essay, Naturalism and Libertarian Agency, Moreland described his libertarian view of free will. So according to the libertarian model, our actions do not have prior causes. So you are the ultimate cause of your actions. You have the freedom to initiate or stop yourself from initiating any action. We are little gods or unmoved movers. Given any set of preconditions, so in any situation, we can make any choice. If we reverse time and reran that situation over again, you would have the power to make a different choice. So you may ask why I'm citing an apologist to define free will. I don't tend to have a whole lot of reason to cite apologists in my everyday life. But theologians tend to spend a lot of time thinking about free will. It's central to theodicy and many other apologetic works. I'll be dealing primarily with libertarianism as my working definition of free will, though we will discuss compatibilism a little later. So libertarianism is also called contra-causal free will because it holds that our actions do not have prior causes. So this poses a couple of complications for the naturalist, because if our minds are the product of our brains, they're made of stuff, then it's difficult to imagine how they could be causally unbound. Free will, for this reason, is often linked with dualism, the position that the mind is a separate entity from the brain, and it may communicate with the brain in some way, but the mind is a separate non-physical entity. So the soul or spirit is the free agent that acts in your mind. So, free will. Do we have it? I'll quote Schopenhauer. Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. So Einstein actually attributed this to Schopenhauer. However, as often happens, the original source is slightly less pithy. Regardless, this certainly captures the sentiment. Do we have free will? I don't think so. Not the contracausal variety, anyway. So let's talk about determinism. Determinism, why don't I ask you guys, does anyone know what determinism is? Is anyone familiar with determinism? Couple people, maybe. Do you want to maybe give a brief definition of determinism?
Well, I'm sort of thinking of it as being compatible with the solid behaviorist school of thought, that you don't really make the decisions. It's like stimulus and the response, or it's based on environment, but it's not really you making the decision.
Okay, so stimulus, then response. It's from the behaviorist school of thought. That is certainly a determinist position. It is a little more complicated than that, but that's a fair sort of lay definition of determinism. Tim?
I would just add that kind of a pithy way of explaining determinism is no matter how complicated we make one, any AI we ever make will be considered by lay people to be determinist. In this sense.
Sure. Yes. Any AI we ever make
have free will.
Will be considered determinist. Did you have something you just wanted to add?
I think that's just adding to what I was saying. It's like it's all environment. It's not really coming from within, but it's in response to given cues, etc.
Okay. So it's all from the environment. So I'm actually just going to illustrate determinism through the use of a 150-year-old example, Laplace's demon. So I'm going to quote from Pierre-Simon Laplace's A Philosophical Essay on Probabilities. Real quick. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect which at any moment knew all forces that animate nature and the mutual positions of all of the beings that comprise it. If this intellect were vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. Sort of. So, determinism basically holds that we live in a causal universe. And we ourselves are not exempt from the web of causality. So our thoughts and our deeds are fully caused. Decisions that we make are the effects of prior causes and the causes of future effects. Put simply, determinism is the position that your choices have causal antecedents. So given the same options, the same set of preconditions, you will always make the same decision. We still do make choices, however. If you're at a cafe for lunch and you opt for a regular Pepsi instead of your usual diet Pepsi, there was a reason for that. Perhaps many reasons that all came together in that one choice. In fact, the question, why did you do that, I would contend, only makes sense within a deterministic framework. So determinism doesn't say that you're a mindless automaton with no mental life. You still deliberate. Your past experiences will definitely play a role. You'll still make snap judgments based on your emotions rather than on thinking things through. All of these factors, however, are fully caused and causally affect your decision-making process in turn. So determinism does constrain you, but it only constrains you to act within your own character, which doesn't seem too bad. The process of deliberation. So, we make decisions, okay? And I'll try to illustrate a sort of toy model, as Dennett might put it, of how we might make decisions. Our decisions in the deterministic framework are influenced by a multitude of factors. Some may be consciously recognized, and some we would not recognize, but they would still play an influence on our decision-making process. So, from the deterministic perspective, our decisions are the result of a calculus. So, a bunch of variables go in, a decision comes out. That seems fairly antagonistic, I think, to the process of free will, the way we think of ourselves as making decisions. But bear with me. So I'd like to contrast that, actually, with the idea of contra-causal free will. So let's say you're walking down the street and you come to a don't walk sign, okay? You want to cross. You're waiting. The sign still says don't walk. Perhaps you're running late for a meeting. Perhaps you've been standing in line all day and you're feeling impatient. Perhaps you were recently issued a citation from a police officer for jaywalking. Yes, they do that sometimes. Does any of this factor into your decision to cross against the light or not? If you're a libertarian agent, the answer has to be no, or at the very least, not necessarily. Because your thoughts and deeds are not caused. You simply choose. And I would contend that in many ways, a free choice is a meaningless choice. Weighing your options is a deterministic process. In fact, weighing one's options is an excellent analogy for the way that decision-making works within the deterministic framework. So we have a balance scale here. Let's say we add 5 grams of silver to the left side. Then we add 15 grams of gold to the right. Then we add 35 grams of copper to the left-hand side. And finally, 30 grams of lead to the right-hand side. Which side is heavier? Well, even though it may seem like a close call, 30 grams of lead and 15 grams of copper on the right-hand side will always... lead and gold, will always weigh more than 5 grams of silver and 35 grams of copper on the other side. If you weighed them a second time, could it have come out differently? Let's try this again. I'll expand on my earlier example to illustrate how this decision-making process might work. When deciding between Pepsi and Diet Pepsi, your decision may be influenced by a multitude of factors. Let's say you have a sweet tooth. But a coworker recently made an insensitive comment about your waistline. That said, you've heard that aspartame might be the result of a secret government mind control project. Perhaps you suffer from diabetes. But maybe you have a strong dislike for that aftertaste common to diet sodas, or as I call it, the aspartaste. Your decision may be subconsciously affected by seeing a magazine with a slim model on the cover. Or by the fact that your father used to drink Diet Pepsi every time he worked on the car. Do we have options in a deterministic universe? Does it really make sense to say that you chose the Diet Pepsi over the Pepsi? Doesn't that imply that things could have worked out differently? Well, in a sense, things could have worked out differently, had a different set of contingencies being in play. When options are presented, we don't know what we'll choose, but that doesn't make our choice free from causal influence. So imagine you're standing before a door. You might say, maybe there's a person behind that door. Now, either, I think we'll all agree, either there is or there isn't a person behind that door. Only one of those propositions is true, and which one is true has already been determined. Your statement, maybe there's a person behind that door, reflects only your ignorance of which of those propositions is true. Likewise, maybe I'll have a Diet Pepsi doesn't have to reflect a real set of options, in a sense. It may simply reflect your own uncertainty about which of those options you will eventually choose. I'll briefly go over a little bit of evidence for determinism. To quote Giulio Giarello, yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. So, first off, although they're not without their critics, the studies of Lebet and Haynes provide evidence that the decisions that we think we're making are actually made between 500 and 1,000 milliseconds before we think we're making them. And what that suggests is that the choice that we experience when we think we're making decisions may be sort of a self-report in the brain. It may be an epiphenomenon. There's also a significant body of evidence from psychology showing that our decisions are consistently, predictably altered by psychological priming. So if, for example, you're doing the psychologists will, there's one experiment done recently where they would present people with scrambled words, and they would have to unscramble them, and then they'd be interviewed afterward. Some of the people unscrambled neutral words. Some of the people unscrambled words that were unpleasant or aggressive, like interrupt or blunt, those sorts of words. And when those people unscrambled the aggressive words, they were significantly more likely to interrupt their interviewer during the interview process afterward than the controls. So that's just one example of priming. We also have transcranial magnetic stimulation. Our brain, and especially our moral choices, actually, this has been recently demonstrated that can be affected by applying a significant external magnetic field to the brain. There's also the case of Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas Gage was a 19th century railway foreman who was seriously injured on the job. In an accidental explosion, he had a steel rod blown clear through his head, in one eye and out the top of his head. He survived, but his personality and behavior were severely altered. According to the attending physician, he became profane and impulsive. I hesitate to mention this because there is a lot of misinformation about the Phineas Gage case. It was 150 years ago. And there have been some less conservative conclusions drawn from this case. But I think that it does serve to demonstrate that our decisions are not entirely freed from the web of causation. So, of course, at this point, you're probably all, raring to get out of your seats and say, but you're wrong here, and this is why. So, like Darwin, I will try to cover anticipate a few objections. So, the first one. This is probably the one that I hear most often. If determinism is true, then our concepts of morality and justice are meaningless. We would have no responsibility for our actions. So I've got two problems with that one. First off, it's not true. Maybe it's true that we can't assign ultimate blame or ultimate responsibility to the actors involved, even when they're doing things that we would consider morally reprehensible. However, there are several ethical systems around that don't require us to assign ultimate blame to the actors. Consequentialism comes to mind. Also, some interpretations of virtue ethics. And while a punitive system of justice makes obviously no sense under a deterministic framework, a correctional system does. And secondly, even if it were true... Is that what you're going to say, Brendan? Okay, so do you want to say it?
It is a hot fallacy, I believe. Basically, whether or not it makes morality and justice meaningless doesn't really matter because that doesn't, in the end, change whether or not it's true. It's either true or false, and
regardless of the implications.
That doesn't change whether it's true.
So what Brendan is saying is, regardless of this objection, that objection doesn't actually address whether determinism is true or false. It just says, but if determinism is true, it sucks. Maybe. I guess it depends on how you look at it. That's life. So that's actually an argument from final consequences. And a lot of, actually, the objections to determinism boil down to an argument from final consequences. It's a fairly common logical fallacy. So, if determinism is true, I'm just a robot. Yep, guess so. But if determinism is true, and people know this, then they're more likely to cheat and steal. Yeah, actually. There has been some psychological studies that have been done, and when people are primed with deterministic phrases, they are more likely to cheat. However, first of all, those studies weren't great. We can discuss maybe some objections to them a little later. But they also don't address the truth or falsity of the claim of determinism. Okay, so the second one. But what about the soul? So I'm more or less assuming monism for the purposes of this talk. I think that to explain, monism is the position that our mind is a function of the brain, that the mind is not somehow a separate entity. Whereas dualism is the position that the mind is a separate entity from the brain. So maybe a soul or spirit, if you're going Cartesian. I think the principle of parsimony and fairly solid neurological evidence basically puts a nail in the coffin for dualism. Dualism falls apart in the light of modern psychology and neuroscience. It's a fact that our core personality attributes can be significantly altered due to physical changes, trauma, chemical agents, what have you, affecting the brain. And a soul, if it exists, would seem to be completely redundant. We can discuss this in a little bit if you would like. The next objection, quantum indeterminacy. That is all. This is actually a really serious problem for a strict interpretation of determinism. I don't mind admitting that. I'm not advocating a strict clockwork universe necessarily. What I am, in fact, doing, when I say determinism, I'm really arguing against the contra-causal version of free will. So the quantum indeterminacy argument, modern physics does say, if I understand correctly, Javier, that there are genuinely indeterminate events that happen at a quantum level. There are two reasons, however, to think that these have no impact on the free will discussion. The first is that indeterminacy does seem to cancel out at the macroscopic level. And neurons and synapses, while they are quite small, they're not small enough to be affected by that sort of uncertainty. And secondly, even if quantum indeterminacy did have an impact on determinism, if it did have an impact on our cognitive process, how does that open the door for free will? I'll quote Jeremy Behan. He's an adjunct instructor of philosophy at Kendall College. This is how he put it. Quote, an indeterminate event is even more frightening than a determinate event, because even with a determinate event, you can say, hey, look, my past experiences, the influence of my environment, everything like that goes into this choice. But with a genuinely indeterminate event, if that event could affect consciousness, then that's something that just happened. And something that just happens randomly is not the same thing as freedom. Then we'll talk, fourth one, determinism is unfalsifiable. Now, this is actually a position that I have a little bit of sympathy with. It's probably the most coherent of the objections. However, I still disagree. Surprise, surprise. Lab studies can and do show predictable, replicable causal influence on our actions. Now, you may object, hold on, influenced is not the same thing as determined, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, given the obvious difficulties in controlling for all of the variables in these lab studies, we can't realistically expect a 100% determined outcome. Even if determinism were true, we wouldn't expect a determined outcome in these studies. We can expect a strong influence at best, probably. The brain, pretty complicated. Secondly, even if our decisions can only be influenced strongly by causal factors outside of our control and even outside of our recognition, causal factors that we're not even aware of, if that's true, how can our choices be called in any meaningful sense free? Saying that we're influenced in many ways, but there might still be some little part somewhere in the brain, some module that is completely free from causal influence, that really seems to boil down to me as to a free will of the gaps argument. What do you guys think? Are there any other objections to determinism? I've got a couple more here that I don't really have time to go into. I'll throw them up on the Winnipeg Skeptics website. But are there any other objections you want to level against determinism before we move on?
I think my biggest one is that determinism assumes that there's a reason why we do things, and there may or may not be a reason why.
Well, it depends what you mean by reason. Are you talking a teleological reason, like a purpose that is imbued in it, or are you talking just a cause?
Either or, actually.
So we want to contrast determinism with fatalism. Okay, fatalism or predeterminism is the idea that somebody has sort of laid out your path before you, Whereas determinism is only the position that your actions are caused and your thoughts and deeds are caused.
And to go back to your Diet Coke or Pepsi example or whatever, I'll ask for a Pepsi, she gives me a Diet Pepsi, and then you walk away. There's always examples of that happening.
So if I just want to make sure I understand your question there, or your statement. So you ask for a Diet Pepsi. She gives you a regular Pepsi.
Let's just say she gives me an iced tea.
She gives you an iced tea, okay? And I'm not seeing the objection to determinism.
Of course.
To me, I mean, that would have a causal influence on me. There's a part of my brain that would go, this is not what I asked for. Excuse me.
But then there's also that part, for me, you look at it, you shrug your shoulders, you just walk away.
Sure.
Yeah.
Chaos. Right. Now, I would not deny. Again, I'm not arguing for a strict interpretation of determinism. I agree. I wouldn't deny that there is that chaos does play a role. I mean, whether it's at a quantum level or not. I'm not saying that. I'm not arguing for Laplace's demon, right? That you could, if you knew well, first of all, it's implausible to think that any entity could know everything about everything in the universe, because obviously the brain required to hold that knowledge would be bigger than the universe itself to some very large degree, etc. However, I don't see how chaos opens the door for freedom of choice. I mean, it opens the door for randomness. Yeah?
Well, in this example, it kind of seems that then there's another choice you need to make. So the first choice was what you wanted to order, and you ordered Diet Pepsi. And now you're presented with another choice of whether you want to keep the iced tea or go back to the Diet Pepsi.
Sure.
So it would be once again the same things coming into play. A number of variables can decide on whether you keep it or whether you complain enough.
Sure. And Daniel Dennett, actually, we'll talk about this very briefly with compatibilism. Daniel Dennett, who does advocate for a free will, sort of free will light that's compatible with determinism, he does admit that there is random or pseudo-random, undetermined input into the decision-making process. Brendan.
In the case of the asking for a Coke and getting an iced tea, you can, from a deterministic standpoint, couldn't you just look at that as the server heard something said, and they went on what they've heard in the past to assume what you said was iced tea instead of Coke, or they made some other
sure.
They don't like you, but it's
the server may have randomly made an error, or may have made an error for some determined reason, or maybe made the determined choice to give you the wrong beverage. That's possible.
I'm all for determinism. My disconnect comes up with applying this under the term free will. It seems that as far as free will as it applies to an individual simply means the ability to make decisions, and as far as a practical application, I don't see one. I understand that this does make sense. Everything's caused, and you base your decision on all of these causes and it's affected. But it's fascinating. But I'm wondering, what's the point?
Actually, oh good lord! Remember, I'm taking questions during, right? So I still have.
You're at 30 minutes.
Good lord. Okay. Really quickly.
I'm not going 5 minutes.
Yes, compatibilism. That's really what we're talking about. Some philosophers actually reject the libertarian agent definition of free will, and they state that free will is simply an agent's capacity to act in a manner that is not coerced or restrained. So this is obviously compatible with determinism. However, they don't go so far as to state that had all of the contingencies been the same, the agent could have made a different choice, because that's the libertarian definition. So free will, do we have it? Well, it depends on what you mean. The libertarian version, almost certainly not. However, the compatibilist version, sure, it really depends on how you define free will. And remember, either determinism is true or it's not. You're no more a robot if you believe in determinism than if you believe in free will. So, just to recap very quickly, given that our brains are made of stuff, there's no known mechanism for free choice in a contra-causal sense. Solid evidence showing that our decisions are not causally free, and we all acknowledge that there are reasons for our choices. Remember, a theory about a thing does not change the thing the theory is about. That's it. So if you want an answer to your question, I actually addressed that exact thing. What does this matter? Is it meaningful? On the transcript that is up on the Winnipeg Skeptics site right now.
Thank you, Jeff.